what I'd like, that Sejal and I were talking, and we're going to each share something short, because I just kind of like that. I'm hoping that all of our voices will be in the room early on. I'm going to read something actually that I read. I have read at Literati because a poet named Molly Spencer, whose books are available at Literati, invited me to read this at a book launch of hers. But I'm going to do it again. It's short. It's called Snail Picking, and it goes like this. It's the earliest essay I wrote for this collection, and one of the things Sejal and I have in common that we've talked about is that all of our essays were written over many years, about the same period of time. This one was something I was working on back when I was a grad student at UM. Snail picking. I was at age 9 a god of snails. On the quiet San Francisco cul-de-sac where my family lived, Helix aspersa, the brown garden snail, was by far the most plentiful and least evasive wildlife around. Snails plied the long green fins of our neighbors' agapanthus like barges transiting green canals. I'd unglue them from their shiny trails, hold them in midair, and poke their sensitive horns. They'd ripple and recoil. Usually I'd show mercy, restoring them to their universe of leaves, but sometimes I'd hurl them hard against a garage door where they left Icarus spots. Snails were pests after all. Other times I'd launch them high above the telephone wires. Diminishing as they rose, they'd hang suspended for a moment at the apogee of gravity's arc, little spinning cosmonauts, brown specks on a canvas sky. Watching them, I tried to imagine how it might feel, ganglia lit up like filaments, in that last astonished instant before they fell. Did they experience snail terror, snail rapture? Or were they too dumb and dizzy to experience anything at all? Afterward, on the asphalt, the shattered bubbles of their bodies, veiny and blue, reminded me of the skin testicle I'd glimpsed while browsing my father's medical books. One day, I filled a half-gallon margarine tub with snails, took them home, and set them on my nightstand. Glowing jars of fireflies were for other children. For me, a tub of snails. They climbed the white, translucent walls and clung to the underside of the perforated lid. From my pillow, before turning out my light, I could see their dark forms moving around like thoughts. When I awoke the next morning, the lid was off, and the tub, save for a dozen gray squiggles of turd, was empty. Only after opening the curtains did I spy the slow explosion happening all over my bedroom walls, the small armada, the wakes of light. Thank you. Sejal, I'm going to hand off the microphone to you, but I will mention, since we both published in Brevity, that's where that essay originally appeared, which is a lovely journal edited by Dinty Moore and others. I'm going to mute myself.
Thank you so much. I'm going to read the end of an essay called Walking Tributaries. Since we were just talking about moving, since Eileen just moved. And I'll read the first sentence too. Walking Tributaries. In his book about the upper Iowa River Oneota flow, decoronated David Faldet writes, "We are walking tributaries. The smell we sense in rain, in an ocean, or on the banks of a Midwestern river attracts us because its familiarity runs deep. Iowa returns to me." I am getting ready to move again, to leave New York, and water is what I will remember about New York City too. The East River's pungent, brackish smell, the swirls and eddies, looking across to the lighthouse on the northern tip of Roosevelt Island, this view a few blocks away from where I lived. When I am away from any place I have ever loved, it is the view of water that brings me back. I feel the desire to return to Iowa every summer. What I know how to do, what I love to do, is to walk through a landscape with the layers of every other time I've been there, underneath and around me, shifting as I walk. I am 5 years ago, and now with every step. I am 10, balancing on 2 wheels, pedaling forward, and then pedaling back to brake, and then gliding before I realize I can ride, that I have been riding for 2 minutes, when 2 minutes before I did not know how. In her essay, The Site of Memory, Toni Morrison writes, "All water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was. Writers are like that, remembering where we were, what valley we ran through, what the banks were like, the light that was there, and the route back to our original place. It is emotional memory, what the nerves and the skin remember, as well as how it appeared. And a rush of imagination is our flooding." As I write this, I am readying myself for a trip to India, a place so unfamiliar to me that the thought of going there sometimes makes my skin crawl. I have to remind myself to breathe, to pedal. I have to remind myself I've flown across 2 oceans to India before. I have to remind myself that it's okay to not know my parents' homeland, and that some memory runs in my bloodlines. I have to remind myself that once upon a time, Iowa was unfamiliar too.
Beautiful. Those are both beautiful. So I'm just so happy to be here. And can you all hear me? I'm not showing up. Even though I don't quite know what I mean by here, you know what this space is. I just lived through the pandemic in the heart of New York, which I have to say really was pretty unnerving. And a week ago, I moved to Boston, where I lived before. I spent 25 years in Michigan. So I don't quite know where I am. I can't get my bearings physically, but I feel very at home. I was really looking forward to this event because I felt I would be connected in a certain way, in a certain abstract room with people that I really feel comfortable with. That, you know, we all share a certain love of things literary, literati, essays. I love the work of both Donovan and Sejal, so this feels really at home. And I think a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight is this notion of what home is, what's identity, what does it mean to belong or not belong. I just thought I'd start, since both of our readers tonight started more in poetry and fiction and then moved into becoming primarily essayists and writers of nonfiction. To speak, each of you, a little bit about what that journey was like, how you migrated from one genre to this other, and how you came to, what did you come to think of as, oh, this is what makes an essay, right? Because I think a lot of people who start out trying to write essays, they have an idea, sort of a topic, you know, snails, you know, I used to collect snails and do evil things with them as a boy, or, you know, I've been to a lot of Indian weddings lately and something's going on with that. And then they write for a couple paragraphs, but they don't quite know how that turns into an essay, right? What makes that an essay? So how did you figure that out for yourselves as you were moving from poetry or the short story to this other genre? Like, how did you figure out what, because you're both quite different, you know, Sejal, you write sort of in a more lyrical format, you know, Donovan's a little more journalistic. So how did you each of you make that journey? Fight it out.
I'd love to hear you speak first, Donovan.
You muted yourself, Donovan. Unmute yourself.
There we go. It was off. Sorry. Actually, I love this question. Thank you, Sejal. I'll go. I think this is a good moment to mention something really funny, which is that Sejal and I as teenagers, both published for the literary journal, Hanging Loose, which had a section for high school writers. And then we ended up in the same anthology that came out in the mid-90s. And I had not looked at this book for many, many years. And then even the titles of our poems, you can see like kind of where we're headed. Mine had things like Family Farm, The Ocean in the Shell was one, and Sejal, I don't know if can I share them? Your titles, just your titles. All right. Whoops, I had them and then I lost them here. Grandmother and Through the Eyes of the Dark-Eyed Americans. So those were our poetry titles when we were teenagers. And I think poetry, something I've been thinking actually a lot about, and Sejal kind of reminded me like how it was that I came to do any of these kinds of writing. Poetry, I think I started writing in high school out of homesickness, actually, because my family had moved from California to Texas. And I think sometimes that's what we're doing with our work, is to create a place, a space in language where we feel at home. Moving from poetry to essay, the poem I just read, Snail Picking, actually was a poem. Was lineated, line breaks and everything. And I think one of the things I discovered when I was your student, Eileen, was that for me, I started to feel more at home in the sentence than in the line. I feel like that just the sentence was the kind of, it's like the length of your breath if you're a musician. Like the sentence is where I felt like I could do things with. And then you work on sentence and paragraph and stanza. It slows me down. I think when I'm in poetry, sometimes that acceleration you can get from the line break, I needed that slowing down and quieting. So I have more thoughts on the whole genre thing. Why not fiction anymore, which I did do once upon a time, is I just found that I think I'm better at finding things out than making things up. But Sejal?
It's a really good question. I also, I think, started writing poetry in high school, and I was lucky that in the Indian community I grew up in, there's also just this deep respect for poetry, and even in our little newsletter, they would, publish a poem of mine, and that was lovely. But I applied to MFA programs in fiction and poetry. I did an undergraduate thesis in half poems, half short stories, and I started to feel like my lines were getting longer, and I didn't have a sense of what a line was supposed to do, that I actually wanted to tell stories. But I also felt like I didn't quite know how to tell stories. So there was that. And then also, as the kid of immigrants, when I was applying to graduate school, my mother was like, how are you going to get a job as in poetry? Like, at least maybe you could sell a book. So there was that also. And then I think this happens with writers of color. But when I was writing short stories, people seemed to want to only read them autobiographically. And I did have a number of stories that, I think 5 of them became essays that are in the book. So, and I didn't have to change that much, but I thought of them as different processes. So when I started writing nonfiction, that felt different, but it's still something that I feel like there are pieces that could go in either, but it changes, I think, maybe we have a different expectation for what a short story offers than what nonfiction does.
So, but what makes an essay for you, as opposed to here are some musings on a topic? Like what makes it actually have the shape of a finished essay? Mm-hmm. What takes it from just some random ideas in your head, say about, all these weddings you had been going to, or body of water, or whatever, dance and your relationship to dance? That's a kind of topic.
Right.
I think a lot of people get stuck on the, oh, I have a topic, but they don't know how to take that somewhere. How do you think of that process?
I think it's really mysterious. I feel like I'm sort of moving my way through. And one of the things I loved about reading Donovan's essays also, and I wondered if having worked as an editor, I mean, if that makes you better able to edit your own work. But I mean, I think sometimes I put everything in the kitchen sink into an essay, and then it also becomes about, taking things out. So I don't know if I know. It's mysterious to me. What makes the difference?
Well, I mean, for me, it's always a question, that there's something that has happened and there's something I don't understand about it in the process of trying to figure out an answer to the question. Donovan always wants me to talk about the essay about there's a Jewish cemetery in the middle of a Cadillac plant in what used to be Pole Town in Detroit. And my friend Marion Krasowski took me there once. You can go twice a year during 2 of the Jewish holidays. And I was just like, this is a very basic question, which is why is there, they tore down a huge part of Detroit, a huge neighborhood that was semi-happily coexisting of, whites, African Americans, Poles, Catholics, Jews, and everything was destroyed to build this massive Cadillac plant, except this one Jewish cemetery, and you want to know why, right? And there's also the question of why am I interested? So I start out with the question until I can come up with an answer, but I'm always curious about how other people think of, and I kind of brainwashed, I think, Donovan into thinking of that essays. But there's something called lyric essay, and for example, I had the pleasure of teaching with Ann Carson, who was just the master of the lyric essay, and her mind works completely differently from mine. She's just this genius, and I'm really interested in how people who have this different conception of what an essay is, say a lyric essay, how they think of it.
I do like that, what you said about the question. I mean, I think with weddings, I hate getting dressed up. So I think like, why do I, what is it about weddings that fascinates me?
Right. And what baffles people is that they don't think a question like that's enough, right? It's got to sound like some grand philosophical question that you would take in a, graduate philosophy course to be a good question. But that question of like, why do I go to all these weddings when I hate dressing up is a great question to pursue an answer to.
And I'll just say, I think the other thing is that because for Donovan and me, right, the essays in the book were written over a long time, I realized, I have a different perspective on weddings in my 40s than I did in my 20s. So
Well, that raises another question. So I think the moment we're all in, it feels as if you're going to write anything, especially in nonfiction, it should be timely, right? That if what you're writing isn't about the pandemic or about racism in America and, Black people being killed in the streets, that it's just not the time to write it now. It's not important. And yet, it takes so long, unless you're writing for the web, between when you write and when it comes out. And let alone, you both said that these essays were written over a very long period of time, right? Sometimes it's 10, 15, 20 years before the essay you wrote and published in a journal comes out in a book. So you also kind of try to achieve a kind of timeliness, right? So I wonder in this moment how the two of you are thinking of as your collections are coming out. The question of timeliness, like, does it speak to this moment? Or does it speak to the moment when I wrote the essay? Or does it speak to eternity where, you're hoping that there's a kind of timelessness? How do you think of that as essayists with collections coming out, who are also living in the moment right now, which is just about the most exciting and fraught moment any of us have lived through?
I mean, I would certainly say that I don't feel that that this collection is particularly topical, or what people should be reading to make sense of what's been happening over the. I mean, it's been happening for hundreds of years, but what's commanding our attention so much now. But I will say that one, I write, as you know, Eileen, extremely slowly. So while I have done literary journalism, I think I've always learned that because I wrote about the Flint water crisis, but I took 9 months to do it and was very late. And I feel like it's part of, for me, it's both neurotic, but also there's also a kind of ethics to it where I feel like I really want to understand and hear a multitude of voices before I dare to join. Some of these essays, just to go back, and I don't think I have found gathering them or thinking about what to read now. Like I think that they essays. I think this is true of Sejal's book. I think it's true in Moments in Mind that they're not topical or timely, though time is one of my preoccupations as it is for Sejal. But there's echoes, and there are ways in which you're telling it slant, sometimes consciously. There are resonances. I mean, I know that and sometimes unconsciously. So part of my project here was to excavate my own autobiography, but to go back farther and to try to kind of answer the questions about into what stories was I born, right? And so I think of it as archaeological. And some of that excavation means that there are ways in which I'm thinking about some of the myths that have come down to us through American history that require examination. I think for my family, myths associated with the American pastoral or the settlement of the Midwest was very on my mind. And then in some ways, when I was writing about rusty tools, I was trying to figure out where the boundary between memory and nostalgia is, how remembering can curdle into something like nostalgia that's a lie or a fiction. And I wasn't thinking, when I wrote that essay in 2004 about Trump's America, but in some ways I think the nostalgia has been with us in a toxic form, in a very open way that was perhaps a little more hidden when I was writing that essay. Sejal, do you have?
Yeah. Oh, am I muted? No. Okay. It's a great question, Eileen. I mean, I was thinking about, oh, well, actually, Donovan, this goes back to the event that you did last night, what Jordan Kistner, right? I don't have, I struggled to find an epigraph for the book, but what I had at one point was, we don't know the effects we have on each other, but we have them, which is from Sheila Heti's How Should a Person Be? So I think one of my concerns over time is just, what stays with you? What affects you? What affected me? My parents just sold their car, an old car, this week, and my mother just told me that she found the Monsoon Wedding, my Monsoon Wedding CD in the car, and I didn't even remember where it was. But the one that matters more to me, and that I've been thinking about more, is the Mississippi Masala soundtrack. And so, I kind of drove my my press crazy at the end when I was proofing, because I wanted to make all these changes in my book. So the hardest thing for me was to let it go and know that, it stops at a certain point, right? Our lives are keep going. But also, some of the essays were written, were originally for the Kenyon Review blog. So, they were published soon after I wrote them. And then other essays took years and were first published in the book. And so I think it's been, for me personally, been a little bit of a struggle to say, I'm not sure how it's speaking to this moment. I myself it takes me so long, I think, to metabolize something that.
And I wasn't saying that it needs to. I was saying that maybe there are other, I don't say priorities, but that you feel that you should be timely, but that it's a genre that may not lend itself. There's journalism, and then there's essay, the essay form, and maybe it's a different notion of what's timely. I also was curious how you were thinking about your audiences as you wrote, because you're each writing sort of about and from within a certain defined community, but of course, readers aren't necessarily of that community. So Donovan's writing about the Midwest as, in the Great Lakes, as a white guy who's living there, but he didn't grow up there, right? And I can't imagine that he's thinking he only wants his readers to be Midwestern white guys. And you're writing from, this Gujarati Indian growing up in Rochester community, which is very, but, and my students often struggle with this, and so do I. How much do you care about audience members or readers who may not belong to that community? I think for me, it was very powerful when Toni Morrison, came out with her groundbreaking essay about the, suddenly not thinking about white readers. She had been to Africa and she thought, oh my goodness, nobody here cares at all about what white readers, they don't translate for white readers, they don't care what they think, and I'm gonna do that. And yet, so you want to do that. On the other hand, you're thinking, I want to reach as wide an audience as possible. Do I translate this like literally, there's some term, or do I explain, or do I take into account people's prejudices? So, I spent 25 years in the Midwest, more if you count my time in Iowa, and then I moved to Manhattan, and, there are prejudices about New Yorkers in the Midwest that I spent all this time combating, and then I go to New York and hear what people say about the Midwest. I'm like, you can't talk about Michigan that way. That's terrible, So I just wonder how, when you're writing or when you put together your books, you did or didn't think about who your audience was and how much you wanted to either translate or win them over or educate them or not here.
I think about audience a lot. I think sometimes maybe too much. I think that I have to kind of get myself to not think about them in order to finish a first draft, but certainly in a second draft or a third draft, I think about it a lot. And it really is, I think, different for each piece. I think as a man who's lived in America for 48 years and having grown up with the privilege of certain blindnesses, I have been working, trying to be more mindful of audience members who aren't like me. And I think that's something that's usually, I can think of many cases where that work has felt necessary and right. And I'd rather do it in the writing and in the editing or in a workshop before it goes out into the world. So I think that sometimes I'm writing, if I'm imagining, I'll do this one. When I wrote this first book, how's this? Okay, I was telling Sejal I really don't like the cover on this book, but it did well, so I won't complain. But I really actually thought of the book, and I use this term a bunch because I see it in a lot of different essayists. Jordan Kisner, who was with me last night, does this in one of hers. Sometimes I think I'm trying to do a kind of ambush on certain readers. Like if I want certain readers who haven't thought about the ocean or toy factories in China, I don't come at them direct saying, here, you have to think about this. I want to bring them in with something that's maybe enchanting or inviting or delight or inspires wonder, and then move them to some other direction. So I also want them to undergo journeys of the mind that I have undergone. So if I had one notion about what had happened in Flint and then I underwent an education, I kind of want the narrative that I'm constructing to take imaginary readers on that education. Some of those imagined readers don't need the education, some do. Sejal, what do you?
I really struggled with this. I think it was different for each essay for me too, as I wrote it. And then when I was looking at it as a whole manuscript, when one of the things that I worked on with the press was they wanted me to follow Chicago Manual of Style. So any words that weren't in English would be italicized. And, I was horrified. And when I said, that would be othering my own, language and experience, they were willing to go with it. But it was, I was surprised that it was a conversation that we had to have. But I went back and looked at actually a few of the early essays like Kinship, Cousins, and Kitschy. That was published in the Massachusetts Review, I think in 2004. And it was, the words were italicized then. So it's also sort of where I've moved to as a writer. But after, I think a book is a compromise for me. So there were places where I pushed and said, no, I don't want, I'm writing for myself and people like me. And then, but that didn't mean that I don't want people who aren't like me to read, in whatever way, who aren't like me in whatever way. But I noticed that I think my notes are really like an afterword. And I did some explaining in them, something I never intended to do. I don't think that this, I have my first name in Gujarati, and I don't think you can see that. And this opening poem, Prelude, and I had never intended to translate that. That's the only, one of the few Gujarati words that I know that I remember, my name. And I did translate it because my husband doesn't know Gujarati and I wanted him to know. But then later, after I finished my book, I read Kathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings, and she quotes her mentor, Myung Mi Kim, saying illegibility is a political act. And I remembered that from being a poet, that not everything needs to be explained. And in fact, some of the strongest writing, I think, is when it's not. So when I look at the book, I see definitely in some places where I was really struggling with it. In this essay, Saris and Sorrow, the last long essay, there's a direct address. Our wedding was big, but not for the reasons you/Americans might assume. Or I think I really was struggling with who is the audience for this.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, as the oldest person here, I've witnessed this transition from when I was young and you had to italicize foreign words. And I always loved if you teach undergraduates and you use like a Norton anthology, and whenever there's anything the least bit, questionable, like not from white middle class culture, there's a footnote with a translation or an explanation. And my students always thought that the authors did that they were writing the footnotes. And I said, no, the authors hate the footnotes. And then, that changed with Alice Walker, Color Purple, where she refused to, translate, African-American speak. And then Junot Diaz really refusing. But my student, Ulam Akpan, who wrote this wonderful book, Saving One of Them, which went on to great acclaim. So his stories are set in all these African countries and people are speaking patois. And he came to me, what do I do? The publisher wants me to have a glossary translating all the words. And I said, no, say no. That's the cornies. You don't have to do that anymore. So it's been very interesting to watch this, transformation of just the literal act of whether things have to be translated or not, but also the whole question of do you care, do you have to, personally, I think it's a decision a writer needs to make to keep from going crazy when writing. Am I writing for this audience or that audience, or, so what your decisions are, but that choice is, very much yours to make. But it's just fascinating to see how both handle that.
I have one last thought, and then Sejal, I don't know if we should skip our longer readings or maybe just do a little short version of what we'd imagined, just because I noticed the time. But my one other thought that we're having a good conversation, and maybe that's what should happen. But was I writing for highly specialized disciplinary communities. So if you write among scientists, this is a different answer to your audience question, but if I'm writing about physical oceanography, like for me, I feel like I'm writing for two different audiences at the same time. Like, because there with scientific papers, you do have to translate. I mean, I feel I'm not going to quote the language, the polysyllabic Latinate science language in dense paragraphs, right? So there's translation, but you want it to be legible to the people who aren't initiated into that language and to the people who are in a different way, right? In an issue of subdiscipline.
One thing I love about both your books, I think I'm going to ask one more question and just ask you guys to read some more, is how you both complicate identity. You know, you both show so beautifully how there's not this monolithic Midwest or Great Lakes region. There's not this monolithic sort of Indian American, Gujarati, identity. And you're very much trying to complicate and question that. Something I learned years ago from James Allen McPherson at Iowa, who I wish I could go more into that. But just as a last thought, do you think that identity, is something that we inherit and have to discover, that we create for ourselves, that we imagine? How do you feel that, identity is working in your collections? Is it in the process of writing all those essays, did you discover who you were, create who you were, imagine who you are? What do you think? I think it's a particularly American question.
Yeah. I mean, there's an essay that didn't make it in the book because it may be the next book, where I spent a lot of time going to my grandmother's birthplace. She was on the wrong side of the tracks in a small town near the Mississippi, first in her family, the first generation to go to college, et cetera. And I think for me, I wanted to understand, it's the closest thing I have to a geographic origin in my family. It's very scattered. And I wanted to understand that, that's where does our family come from? And it was such a strange and disorienting experience for me spending time down there. And I think I need to spend more time. So that's one way of answering. I think the other way, and you know what, Sejal, I'm just going to read the first paragraph here that I have for my intro, because I think it's the answer I had time to compose maybe to that question, which is just this: we are born into stories already in progress. Those our families tell or avoid telling. Those recorded in history books and newspapers or left out of them. Those encrypted in biomes and geographies, even in our bodies. Every word we read or write carries with it, like vestigial mutations in a strand of DNA, or like the isotopes recorded in the ear bone of a fish, or like the chemical signatures preserved in a core sample of glacial ice, the history of its usage. We are surrounded by a multitude of facts whose significance is neither stable nor self-evident.
You can't hear me. Okay, I said that's so beautiful. I love that paragraph. I think that I also have been thinking about essays that didn't make it into the book, and about bookstores in Rochester, and about my first grade play. And I wonder, how would the book read differently? In some ways I was responding, I've always been really interested in place, but I think growing up brown in a really segregated city, and there not being any history, there's just not education, I think. I mean, certainly not about the 1965 Immigration Act, but also I was thinking about an essay that I wrote called Who's Indian, that was at first called Where Are You From? And a reviewer quoted it a section back where I said, my father's from India, my mother was born in Uganda and grew up in Kenya, we're Indian, I'm Indian. But I thought, really, what's interesting to me when I look at the book now are the things I I didn't say are the silences or maybe what I skipped over, which is that I wanted to say, and I remember saying, well, I'm half Kenyan. If I'm American because I was born here and I haven't seen any other country except Canada, which was true for me as a child, then why wouldn't my mother be Kenyan? If I said Kenyan, they would assume that she was Black. And so, I mean, I think from a very young age, I was very interested in place, but also the fact that I had never seen my parents' homes. I've never been to where their countries with them. So in a way, it was that gap between what I was asked to speak about and what I was actually interested in.
Well, that's wonderful. And I could ask 50 more questions, but I think everybody would rather hear you guys read a little more from each of your work. So Sejal, why don't you go first this time?
We only have till 8, right?
I think we should totally feel free to kind of go after that. To all of our attendees, this has been a really, I've been a little derelict, but this has been a phenomenal conversation. So I've yet to hop on, but we're going to be recording tonight's event, and we currently have 2 questions. So Sejal, I think you should feel free to read. And if you have to drop out, don't worry. We're actually going to be posting a recording of this later to our YouTube channel, so everybody can tune in again and kind of spend some time with all of tonight's authors. So feel free to, you know, read as you wish, please.
Well, I'll take that as an opportunity also to just say, I mean, talking about place, just that we were all in the same place in Iowa, right? And but Donovan, you and I didn't meet, but it is just thank you for inviting me to be part of this event. And I'm so happy to, our conversations about our books has been so meaningful to me. I didn't know what it would be like to publish a book in a pandemic, but I had not published a book before. And I think just getting to talk about the process and having read your work when we were young, and just has just been wonderful. You know what, I'm going to read the paragraph from my essay, Matrimonials. And an earlier version of this essay was the nonfiction introduction to my fiction MFA thesis. And it was called Introductions. But it started about my brother's wedding. So this is about his wedding. That June day in 1992 was one of the happiest in my life. Technicolor, nearly. It was the first wedding for both families. My brother is the eldest grandchild on both sides, and my sister-in-law is the eldest on one side, the second eldest on the other. The occasion felt momentous, had weight. It rained that evening, but my strongest memory is of dancing, not the dinner, not the weather, not that dinner was held up. It was the first time these separate cultures, Indian and American, and for me, distinct selves coexisted, even merged in one semi-public place. Hundreds of people dancing. The experiences of Indian Americans at this wedding, from the sheer number of people, the food, the music played, rendered our experiences, in Adrienne Rich's words, quote, real and normative. The culture foregrounded was ours. This was the first time I caught a glimpse of our faces in a larger cultural space. We were beautiful, multiple, mirrored, carnivalesque. We filled the room.
Lovely.
It's beautiful, multiple, carnivalesque.
Do you want to read those couple paragraphs about diving backwards into the lake?
Yeah, I'll do that. I thought I might read about I was thinking of reading about the family farm, because this goes back to your earlier questions about organizing essays, Eileen. I do use your kind of detective work model of of having the question, and I often need those, but I also like to use, for me, musical forms that I'm borrowing from poetry or from music. So I'll often think about theme and variation, having motifs recur. I also think of like the dramatic structure of from short story sometimes comes into play. And it's really about orchestrating all of them. One of the recurring motifs in my book is of a kind of, is the excavation metaphor, which I know, Sejal, you've thought about excavation too, in different ways. But of that, like, what's buried here? It's all part of the question of where am I? It's the who am I and where am I question. But to know that you can't just answer that from your biography or from your memory, right? Because we're born into these stories. So for me, trying to understand geography has been a kind of an archaeological project. So I will read what you suggested, Eileen. I have to find it. But I actually went twice with archaeologists out onto the Great Lakes. This one comes from a rather unpleasant excursion with a half-mad shipwreck hunter. I'll read. Let me think if there's a good place to. Maybe I'll start here. The fishing boat was anchored off Poverty Island, one of several in a chain of uninhabited islands at the northern end of Lake Michigan that obstruct the entrance to Green Bay. Also aboard the fishing boat was a shipwreck hunter and a team of commercial divers he'd hired. The shipwreck hunter had spent 3 decades and upward of $1 million searching for a wooden French brigantine last seen in 1679. He was convinced he was on the verge of finding it. The trail of clues he'd assembled in the historical archives seemed to him unassailable, and he'd brought me along to document his triumph. Not all men who dive are philosophers, I now know. Some of them are retirees squandering their life fortunes on misbegotten hunts for missing ships. In emails, the shipwreck hunter had referred to our outing as an expedition, had dressed accordingly, which is to say nautically, in a navy blue windbreaker and a navy ball cap, embroidered with golden laurels. On the windbreaker, stitched over his heart, was a date and the name of the ship, Le Griffon, for which he had spent most of his adulthood searching. A little icon of the ship sailed above his ball cap's bill, encircled by the words, imagine, explore, discover. He'd meant to bring matching Le Griffon t-shirts for everyone aboard the fishing boat to make the expedition feel more expeditionary, but he'd forgotten them back at his condo, and this trivial oversight seemed to fill him with outside regret. The Great Lakes, I'm going to skip it down a little. The Great Lakes are good at remembering. They're also good at obliterating. Nevertheless, the shipwreck hunter had agreed to send me down, and the time had come. Perched on the rail of the fishing boat, tugging on my flippers, wearing a rented 7mm wetsuit, I was beset by second thoughts. At scuba school, the instructor had elaborated in memorable detail the assorted, gruesome ways that scuba diving can abbreviate a life, the most memorable of which, to my mind, was this: ascend too quickly without exhaling, and your lungs will pop like balloons. At bottom, 60 feet down, it would be a comparatively warm 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Sometimes at the bottom of the Great Lakes, under the hazy pane of the thermocline, liquid water descends below 32 degrees without freezing on account of the pressure. Into their suits, the commercial divers who were with us that day had pumped one of the warm water. The shipwreck hunter had told me that my exposed face might feel as if it had been stung by bees, but a 7mm suit would be warm enough, he'd assured me. In my head, to calm myself, I recited the opening lines of Adrian Rich's Diving into the Wreck. First, having read the Book of Myths and loaded the camera and checked the edge of the knife blade, I put on the body armor of black rubber, the absurd flippers, the grave and awkward mask. You may think this an embellishment, this is me again, that perched on the rail of a fishing boat, squeezing your nostrils shut, preparing to tumble backward overboard, you'd have better things to think about than a poem, but I promise you I'd committed those lines to memory because I wanted to write about the experience someday, yes, but also because I wanted more than the bright white nylon anchor line to guide me down into Lake Michigan's cerulean immensity, and because I wanted to remember why it was I was doing this. I was doing this because I'd imagined that descending the water column would be like time travel, like flippering into the past, as if fathoms were centuries.
Yeah, I'm gonna do a little audible clap. Thank you, Donovan. Thank you, Sejal, for that. That was lovely. And our first question tonight comes from Molly Spencer. And Molly is wondering, if the basic unit of poetry is the line, it seems to me that the basic unit of nonfiction prose is the sentence. I would love to hear everyone talk about their ideas about the sentence. What is their relationship with the sentence as a unit of language and meaning? And what do they aim for in their sentences? Or is aim not a part of the process? Am I, a mere poet, wrong that the basic unit of prose is Molly also admits, I realize this question is not very concrete, but I'd love to hear what these writers have to think about sentences, and I can't agree with her more. So I'd love to hear what all three of you think about the sentence.
Sejal, go for it.
Well, I mean, I think everything begins with the sentence and syntax. Maybe that's similar to, well, syntax, at least with poetry, but I found myself really looking at, in reading Donovan's essays or when I was working on my own, the moves that are made from one part of an essay to another. And when we spoke the other night, you know, like when I put in subheadings or didn't, like what kinds of leaps are you asking your reader to make? That's often, certainly on a, syntax is important, but I'm also just really interested in like the move from you know, for me, in my essay about Iowa that I read from, you know, going from bicycle riding to what it was like to live in Iowa to I'm going to India, and that you know, I mean, in some of your essays, Donovan, there's so much more in there. I'm interested in those moves myself.
Well, I had this experience at an earlier event this month where one a member of the audience commented that that my sentences I sound like I'm Dylan Thomas one moment, and then I'm a 21st century American speaking the vernacular the next, and she wondered if I didn't quite know what world I was in. So, and I think that's probably true. Sometimes I think I have and at times conflicted but still persistent love of certain 19th century writers who I think even on the sentence level and paragraph, I mean, I was reading Moby Dick the whole time I was writing Moby Duck, so I think sometimes I might overindulge a bit. And I love there's an oratory, there's a drama to the sentence. So Melville's sentences, I think, are often in my ear. So are James Baldwin's, who writes these gorgeous, there's this elegance with irony that he's getting at the same time. I think that all of those, they're ghosts of other writers, I think, in our sentences. I do like to have I think a lot, and I think the training in poetry is part of this, that I'm thinking about the music. For me, the unit of composition is the sentence, and it's also the paragraph, because I do think I still sometimes think of a lot of my essays began as one-page prose poems way back in the day. And so thinking of that kind of block of each paragraph being almost like its own unit. Now, like the sentence of the first piece I read is it wasn't originally, the first sentence was missing. I was at age 9, a god of snails. And for me, it was like somehow when I put that sentence at the beginning, and also even just having the parenthetical element right in the middle, I was, comma, at age 9, comma, a god of snails, is much more interesting to me than I was a god of snails at age 9. So there's something about just like where the pauses are, where the suspense is. That's enough probably from me. Thanks for the question, Molly.
I think that you know, a lot of my answer is informed by the fact that I've been editing student work. You know, I've been an editor for so long. I wrote a column for medium.com on writing. And so this will sound simplistic. I do think you're right that in a short story and an essay, the unit is a sentence. In a novel, I think it's the scene. But a sentence really should just do one thing. And I know that sounds simple-minded, but I think the problem is that it can do one complicated thing, or it can do one simple thing, but if it's trying to do more than one thing, and the writer doesn't know what that one thing is, then you're gonna kind of have a mess. So, you know, you may just be describing a man walking down the street, but you don't put in everything about that man and the way he's walking down the street and the length of his hair and the color of his skin and that he's got a guitar and he's stumbling, because we don't know what in that is important, right? And so I think once people realize that the sentence does one thing, it really helps. Mm-hmm. That said, you know, you're alternating your sentences and you're writing out of some rhythms. I realized at some point when I took my first college writing course, I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish culture where I had to go to Hebrew school after regular school every day for hours and recite these prayers and memorize them. And they all had a certain intonation and rhythm. And I couldn't figure out for a long time what rhythm I was writing to until I realized there was one of these prayers that was utterly meaningless to me in terms of what it said, but I loved the rhythms of it. And, you know, some people grew up learning the King James Bible and they write to that. You know, they're the rhythms of the sentence, but I think you're right that so it is akin to poetry in that, you know, you're thinking in those units, there's a kind of simplicity of focus, but there's this rhythm going on. And as Donovan said, you know, the order of the clauses within the sentence makes it different. So there's a real art to the line in the essay as well as poetry.
Somebody did once notice that I had like whole paragraphs where I was almost falling into iambic pentameter in my first book, and that's I think that's like Melville, but it's Melville and King James version of the Bible. That's what it is. It's my religious childhood.
Interesting is I don't come at all from a poetry background. I can't write a poem to save my life. I come much from the sciences and journalism. And so for me to say that the rhythm of it is so important to me is just, you know, really odd.
Thank you all for those responses. We've got another question coming from Miles Harvey, and he's wondering, one of my favorite lines from Donovan's book is, "Water remembers what we might otherwise forget, in part because what we might wish to forget, we jettison." In her reading, Sejal also equated water with memory. I'm wondering if each writer would like to talk about their interest in water as a subject.
I'm going to let you go first because I'll just like talk for a half an hour probably, since water is one of the big things here. But you, Sejal, brought in the Toni Morrison quote. So why don't you talk about what water is doing in your essays?
I'd like to read something from my book.
Yes.
I'm gonna read the first page of an essay called "Street Scene," almost, and I'll use that to frame my answer. And Donovan, this is for you because you asked. Street
Thanks.
Scene. Parisians call this neighborhood mixed. Mixed is code. It means immigrants. Think Brooklyn, Caitlin says. We're in the 20th arrondissement near Père Lachaise. I'm here to see the Louvre and the Turkish baths. I'm here to visit my friend Caitlin. I have a map and some time for wandering. To travel by yourself and enjoy it is a skill. I don't practice it enough. The 20th arrondissement. Storefronts with fuchsia and blue signs, Senegalese behind tables of patterned scarves, watch caps and leather bags. Music, a low flare around which we warm ourselves at the park, at pool tables, at long wooden bars. Leanne isn't here to tell me where she stayed in Paris. When I think of her, I see us talking in my backyard, splashing in the pool, upstate New York summers. It surprises me. She was never there, but I can see it. The blue pool, our hideaway, beach towels, instant iced tea. I imagine we lay ourselves out on the uneven flagstones, waiting to be hot enough to peel ourselves off and fling ourselves into the water. If I close my eyes hard enough, if I squint, I can almost see it, this scene, that we grew up together. She was that kind of friend. As I walk through Paris, I keep expecting to catch a glimpse of her, vanishing into some narrow street. So this is the first essay that I wrote that I learned was called a lyric essay. And I didn't know what I was doing with it. First, it was a short story. And I showed it to my writing group. And they said, you know, this pool really has nothing to do with, you know, this is an essay about friendship. This is about walking in Paris. This is about a friend who's died. But, you know, that's fine that you had a childhood pool. But what does that have to do with this essay? And that was a moment of, you know, I understood what they were saying. I taught writing also, but the pool was a key for me. And so I think images are those, maybe especially for those of us who began as poets. And it's breaking some rules, I think, but I'm grateful that I connected, and this came from Ekphrasis. It was based on a painting called Street Scene. And there was a color that was the color of this childhood backyard pool. But I think of water for me as maybe something, intuition. I mean, to believe your own feeling that an image has some power.
Donovan, I'm going to go for a second because I want you to be ending it. I don't want to be ending it, but I had never thought, I was going to say, oh, water is not important to me, but it's very important. I grew up in the Catskills, this now defunct Jewish resort area, and it's the Dirty Dancing place. And to me, people were always talking about, so that's where Murder Incorporated, which was the Jewish mob, used to dump the bodies. They would kill people in New York City and then dump the bodies in the lakes near me. And everybody knew that. And they would say, oh, you know, if you go swimming in that lake, you know, be careful where you put your feet. I mean, it had happened long ago, but everybody knew that there had been bodies dumped there. There was a reservoir called Neversink, which had been a town called Neversink, which got sunk to make the reservoir for water for New York City. And so there was this image of a town underneath the reservoir. And the novel I just started during the pandemic has to do with, there was a serial murderer who had a place a couple miles from my house, and he was trafficking in young women and throwing the chopped up bodies in the lake next to his house. And like, everybody knew this stuff was going on or had gone on and would make these veiled references to it, but nobody really wanted to talk about the reality of what had happened. And so to me, water is kind of this, it covers up, but you can still see what it's covering up. And, you know, so like everybody's talking about the Tulsa massacre, it's as if, you know, everybody there knew it had happened. They talked about it, there were the ruins of it, right? But then suddenly it's as if the reservoir goes dry and there's the town again, or there are the bodies. And so to me, it's really beautiful what you were both saying about that. It's both hiding what was jettisoned, and yet it's still there. You can see it kind of, or you could find it, which, you know, a lot of American history, a lot of European history, I think is in that liminal state.
Well, that was lovely, Eileen. I'm not going to try to top it on water. I think I maybe wrung that topic a bit out, but I'll use my last thought on this, and you'll hear it. There is actually last echo of water. I really loved this essay that you wrote, Sejal, about Street Scene, which is an elegy. It's a prose elegy, and one of the things that you and I have in common with our books aside from they took us 20 years to write, and we both published in Bullseye as they're both in memory of someone we loved, right? That's what street scene is. And for me, mine is haunted by probably the person I felt close, probably the person, he felt like a brother to me. And you said the same of your friend was like a sister, like kind of kin. And so I'll just mention this one last thing on water, just so I can get him in the room, since you shared yours, which is that he died at age 39, not in 2014, while exploring the Nile River. He was in Uganda, and he died of heat exhaustion and dehydration. And a few years before, when I went to sea, he was the first person I'd talked to, because I'm much more introverted and like to stay in at my own desk. But he always was going out, and he'd kind of told me to go to sea. And I found this old email. This is something else we do. This is another kind of archaeology or excavation, is finding the found materials. And I found an email he'd sent me with it was just a shopping list about what to travel with if you go to the Bering Strait. So it's got stuff on it like which brand of portable umbrella to get, and that sort of thing. And he's funny in it. He says if he's jokingly mentioning getting a Walter PPK 9mm. If you want grizzly stopping power, go with a 357. And neither one of us ever shot a gun in our lives. So it's I hear his voice and his humor and his wit. And at the end of it, his very last tip was, stay hydrated. I'll send more thoughts as they come along. So that's, I think, where I want to leave it. Stay hydrated. And Sejal and Eileen, I'll send more thoughts as they come along.
Thank you to all three of you for that. That was, I think, I love that I say holding court and we're at 8:19 and we're still holding court. All of you have stayed. Thank you to our attendees for witnessing and participating in this really amazing reading and conversation. Thank you to Donovan Hohn. Thank you to Sejal Shah. And thank you to Eileen Pollack for just giving us a really phenomenal event tonight. And of course, I would be remiss. I'm going to drop a link in there for all of you to be able to check out more about all of tonight's authors and their books, and to potentially order them. If you like tonight's event and you'd like to donate to our event series, please feel free to do so. But I think Donovan has kind of ended it in a way that now me following up, I feel rude for doing, but thank you, Donovan, Eileen, and Sejal. It was such a pleasure.